There are many physical activities that are attributed to working out. Of course, being tired, being sore, hypertrophy of muscle or swelling of muscle, and of course, perspiration. But what exactly is sweat? Why do we perspire? And do you know if you have to have perspiration in order to have a good workout? Hey, don't sweat it, because we're talking about it today on the Personal Edge Fitness Podcast.
Welcome to the Personal Edge Fitness Podcast
with Garrett Williamson.
Health, wellness, exercise, nutrition, and a whole lot more. Got questions? Call us and leave a message at 251-278-EDGE or message us at Personal Edge Fitness on Facebook and Instagram, at Team PE on Twitter, or personaledgefitness.com.
Good day, this is Garrett Williamson, president of Personal Edge Fitness, talking today about sweating and all about sweating, how sweat works, why do we sweat, and what you should know about it concerning your workout. Right off the bat, sweating or perspiration does play a big factor in exercise, or at least in human performance. Did you know that there are only 2 mammals capable of long-distance running, and that humans are one of them? The other, by the way, is horses. I think you may have been able to guess that. I'm sure you're curious about it. While most other mammals can sprint faster, the cheetah and what have you, of course they have the perk of having 4 legs, humans have basically evolved to be endurance runners. The theory is that this made us more efficient hunters and gatherers, made us survive better. Well, what does this have to do with sweat? Well, if it weren't for how efficiently we produce and dissipate perspiration, our ancestors wouldn't have been able to run long distances while hunting, and we probably wouldn't have been able to do things like run marathons. It probably is the reason that our species, Homo sapiens, have survived. But it doesn't just take a long run to make you sweat. It's the little things too, like being outside on a hot day, or taking the stairs instead of the elevator, and even when you have anxiety. But somewhat confusingly, you may also find yourself sweating at night, even though you're totally at rest and when you're just scared or what have you. So what's happening here? What's causing this? I'm going to discuss why we sweat when we're hot, and sometimes even when we're not. I'll give you the reasons why that occurs. Now, before we get into the process of sweating, we can jump into some science. And so I can break down a few different glands that we have in our body and tell you the difference between them. Sweat glands are small, coiled, simple tubular glands that produce sweat. They are found in the dermis of the skin throughout the body. Now, sweat glands are actually broken down into 2 different types called apocrine and eccrine sweat glands. These 2 types of sweat glands differ in a number of ways. They differ from distribution and structure of the gland itself to their excretory mechanisms, and actually the product, the type of sweat that comes out. Now, eccrine glands are what I would call far more common. They're found all over the body, and they secrete a watery product that cools the skin. Now, the apocrine sweat glands are mainly found in the armpits and other areas such as that, and secrete a more viscous, odorous product. Now, actually, it's actually a bit thicker too. But to make it simple, the eccrine sweat glands are the ones that you are typically associate with exercise, and they have that watery, dripping sweat that comes out of them that you're used to getting when you are working out. The rather thick type of mucus, type of sweat that comes from the apocrine sweat glands mixes with bacteria and things like this in your armpit, which is what causes odor. There's quite a few different reasons why we sweat, but at every one of them, the more I look at it, no matter what, boils down to heat, or in this case, more particularly, body heat. I'll tackle one area first because it's pretty easy. It's pretty well understood why we sweat when we're running and what have you. We'll go through that in just a minute. But I want to talk about these apocrine glands, because there's times when we sweat that we feel like, well, why the heck am I sweating? I'm eating spicy food, or I got nervous about something. I got worried about something, and I just started sweating. What's going on there? And even though you may be not in a hot environment, you may not be hot at all, something is tricking your body into making it sweat. Again, it's dealing with heat, because what's happening is your body is getting prepared for something. Now, when we have emotional sweats, which, like I said, comes from apocrine glands, it doesn't serve an immediate temperature regulatory function, but rather one to combat an impending challenge. What happens is your body thinks that, oh my gosh, they're worried about something. They're afraid that they're going to have to jump into their fight or flight mode. And so what the body is going through at that time is a pre-cooling effect. There's a pre-cooling effect going on when it's an emotional sweat. When you're sweating strictly because you're nervous or worried about something or feeling stressed, even though you may not be moving around a lot, even though you may not be in a hot room, that is your body is preparing for those activities, and so it's going to do a pre-cooling of the body. I think it's incorrect, as explained in several articles that I read about sweating. Emotional sweating has nothing to do with heat. That's not really true. It has everything to do with heat because your body is getting prepared for something. Now, the apocrine glands are also the glands that you secrete sweat through when you're eating something spicy. Now, typically spicy food has a chemical known as capsaicin. And what is actually happening, which I think is fascinating, your body's temperature is somewhere around 98.6. Now, there's some fluctuations in it, and I'm sure that many of you have seen fluctuations if you've had your temperature taken during our recent pandemic. You've probably seen your temperature kind of go all over the place, but usually it's somewhere around 98, 98.6. Well, eating spicy food that have capsaicin in it trick the body. They think because your tongue's getting hot, throat's getting hot, they think that you're actually needing to cool off the body. Your body thinks that the body is starting to overheat. So therefore, it is combating it by opening up these apocrine sweat glands and releasing all this sweat. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to tell the waiter at the Mexican restaurant, no, there's nothing wrong with me. I'm just complimenting your food. It is extremely spicy. But that's why we sweat and have that kind of reaction. But let's move over to eccrine for a moment. This is the most common sweat glands, and these are the sweat glands that produce that watery sweat that actually is used as a cooling factor. Let me explain that if you don't know what that means, because especially if you live in the South, you may not have actually experienced the cooling factor. So what happens is the sweat is produced and goes up to the skin, and it relies on a heat transfer, an evaporating heat transfer, a transfer of energy, and a measurement of energy is actually heat, a calorie, which is also a measurement of heat. And so when the sweat gets on the surface of the body, on the surface of the skin, there's an evaporation process that is supposed to take place, and by transferring that energy, you're transferring heat. And so as the sweat evaporates, you cool off. Now, if you live close to the water, you live in a high humid environment, you may or may not have actually experienced this phenomenon, this evaporating cooling sensation. And why? Well, when the sweat gets to the surface of your skin, it joins some water that's already there, the water in the air, and actually it just keeps piling up because it does not evaporate. That's why you're typically cooler in a drier climate. That's why people can go to Arizona and be in the desert and have 110 degrees there versus 100 degrees in Mobile, Alabama. It'll feel much cooler at the 110 in Arizona than it will at 100 degrees in Mobile, Alabama, because Mobile has high humidity. Whereas a desert, Arizona, this area has a much drier climate. That's why they call it a dry heat. It's also why in human climates we have the heat index. This is something that our weathermen talk about a lot. They talk about the heat index. So they'll say that the temperature is going to be 90 degrees, but with the heat index, it's actually going to be 102. Now, the reason for the differentiation is the humidity and the fact that we lack that evaporating effect that transfers energy and cools us off. Now, you can sweat during all kinds of workouts. We usually use the example of running because most people understand that or have experience sweating while running, but you can actually sweat through lifting weights. Anything that increases body temperature. Now, how does lifting weights increase body temperature? Well, you're causing a hypertrophy of muscle is one of the things that's going on. Also, you're expending energy. I mean, if you're lifting a heavy weight, you're expending energy, which is going to drive your heart rate up, which is going to drive basically your body temperature up. And so it's going to cause that effect. But the hypertrophy that I'm talking about, that's an inflammation of the muscle. Hypertrophy is when you, let's say you're doing bicep curls and you sit there and do 2 or 3 sets, and all of a sudden your biceps just blow up massive. I had a client that used to always drop down and do push-ups in a formal dress that was sleeveless. And the reason she would do that is she wanted some definition in her arms. So she would create hypertrophy in her triceps and her shoulders so that she had definitions when she went to a formal occasion. I always found that fascinating. But hypertrophy is the type of inflammation. And so, well, just like it sounds, inflammation, some kind of flaming, some kind of heating up, some kind of swelling, well, that's going to cause your body to try to cool the body down. And so you're automatically going to sweat and have that evaporation. In an air-conditioned climate, if you work out in air conditioning, you typically will say to yourself, well, I don't sweat. Well, actually, you're still raising your body temperature, though it may be harder because you have cooler air blowing on you. But the biggest job of an air conditioning unit, of an AC unit, is actually it has a large evaporator in it. That evaporator draws that water away. It creates a less humid situation. So therefore, it's going to create a drying effect, which is why I tell a lot of clients that when the AC is on, you need to up your water intake. Now, typically the AC, we have air conditioning on when it's hot outside. And if you're hot outside and you're sweating, you're working in the garden, or you're doing exercise, of course, you're going to take fluids in and you're going to combat the sweat that you're losing, the water that you're losing through sweat. You're automatically going to think about that. Of course, I'm thirsty. Look at me, I'm sweating. But many people will tell me that I'll tell them that actually they're very low on water, and they'll tell me in a hot part of the year, yeah, but I'm in my office all day. I've got air conditioning on. Right. You may be losing more water in that situation than you would be if you went outside and ran for 30 minutes. Why? Because you're sitting in a room with a giant evaporator. Now, you're not seeing yourself sweat, but water droplets can come to the surface, and even if they don't, that evaporator is going to continually draw water out of your body, which is another reason why it's so important to maintain hydration, especially in the hotter months, and like I said, even if you're inside. Now, it is very commonly held that, for some people, that if you don't sweat, you're not working out. Well, I'm going to tell you right off the bat, I'll explain it, but that is not necessarily true by any means. So whether or not you do sweat can be a sign of many things. It can be a sign, of course, if you're in an air conditioning room and your sweat's evaporating, therefore you're not noticing it. If you're in a pool and you're swimming and you get out and say, well, I didn't sweat. Well, actually, you probably did. It just washed away with the water. But it can also be a sign of, if you're not sweating, it can be a sign of just a lack of hydration. There was I want to say Muhammad Ali's last fight, where they kept pointing out over and over and over again how he was not sweating. He was working hard. He wasn't sweating. At the very end of the fight, he actually vomited water. He was actually low on water, and they were trying to drink a lot of water during the fight because they could tell he wasn't sweating, therefore he was dehydrated. And that'll, of course, cause all kinds of problems, and I'm sure you don't want me to get into talking about water because you know it's one of my favorite topics and happens to be one of the cornerstones of the Fountain of Youth. But if you don't want to hear about that, I believe it's podcast number 4, The Miracle Pill. Please listen to it. Please stay hydrated. Please take in your water at least 100 ounces a day. Every day that ends in a Y, every day of your life, make sure you're maintaining that amount of water. I promise you, it will make a difference. And it's a difference that you will feel immediately. A positive difference, not just running to the bathroom. Seriously, a positive difference. This is something they notice about Muhammad Ali, and this is something that people notice about themselves. If you're in a hot climate and somewhere where you know you should be sweating, you're out and you're running a 5K, even though you've done it 100 times, it's hot outside, you're not sweating, most likely there's something wrong. And the first thing that I would jump to is looking at your water intake or lack thereof. Of course, I have many clients that think that's the first thing I look at in many cases, and it is true. Lack of water causes all kinds of problems. But definitely when you're exercising strenuously and you're not perspiring when you think you should, it is something to look at as far as your water intake. But it's not absolutely necessary to sweat in order to get a good workout. Your body is very sophisticated when it comes to managing heat. And one of the things it does, of course, is has this perspiration or sweating factor, which allows it to cool the body off. But it's not the only one. One of the things we have is we have skin all over our body and without fur on it. And so that exposed skin is going to cause a cooling effect that we typically would not have. Now, if you are in better shape, you have a lower body fat, it's going to be harder for you to sweat. And the reason being is because a higher body fat on your body serves two purposes. It is an energy store, which is why your body continues to store fat, because it thinks that you're preparing for needing energy later. And you've heard me say many times that the body's first job is to keep the body moving. So therefore, it's going to store excess energy. The other thing that fat does is actually keep you warm. It is an insulator. Now, having a high amount of body fat on your body is like wearing a heavy coat all the time. There's something I used to hear people talk about quite often. They would talk about the fact that they were hot-natured. I had a relative of mine saying there's something about my nature that I'm just automatically hot. I'm a hot-natured person. Well, of course, that's a made-up term. I always thought it kind of funny because I was thinking, wow, is it because the cosmos kind of affect you a little different, increasing the temperature in your body because of the way the molecules are hitting you and the way the energy, kilocalories? No. It typically means you have a high body fat. Now, this may be surprising to you, but I have seen many thin individuals who feel that they are quote-unquote hot-natured. I had a gentleman that passed the 60s, past his 70s even, and always felt hot in my facility. And we keep our facility at a fantastic temperature. We rarely had any complaints, but he would always talk about how hot it is in there. And he would talk to me about, you're going to have to be concerned about the women, especially menopausal women that are going through a change. They're going to be coming in here and complaining to you because you've got it way too hot in here. And he was the only one ever complaining, especially around that time of day. Well, if you were to weigh this individual, he is, as far as I'm concerned, well underweight. Not just as far as I'm concerned, he is textbook well underweight. And he's very thin. So you automatically think, well, he's not fat. Actually, he was obese. You can be thin and you can be light and still have a large amount of body fat on you, which this gentleman sweated quite a bit even when we were doing simple exercises. And he was actually, as far as aerobics is concerned, and endurance, and even strength-wise, he was in good shape. But because of the way he does his nutrition, by starving his body and also not eating enough protein, those two combined will typically create a situation of high body fat. So this person felt like my facility was hot, and he was using that as an example. I'm thin, I should be freezing cold in here. No, body fat has a lot to do with temperature regulation and also has a lot to do with whether or not you sweat. Now, if you don't have as much, like I said earlier, if you don't have as much body fat, you're going to have a lesser tendency to produce large amounts of sweat. But what if you are tied to that old adage that I've got to go break a sweat? I've got to go sweat. And I've had many clients, especially early on in my career, and especially male, that felt like they had to sweat. I've got 2 or 3 clients now that they don't feel good unless they've broken a sweat. And it's sometimes challenging to do because we keep the temperature in our facility at a very comfortable temperature, somewhere between 68 to 73. And in the resistance training we're doing, if we're not doing a circuit style resistance training with somebody because they're actually going to do cardiovascular or our focus is a little different, we a lot of times with our fit, especially with our fit clients, we don't produce sweat. And so some of these gentlemen particularly feel like they have not had a workout. And so they'll get on an elliptical piece or a cardio piece of some sort, and they'll work up a sweat. Now, I understand that there's something about that's more for their head than it is for their body. But it's not absolutely necessary to produce or perspire, produce perspiration, produce sweat when you exercise. That is not a measurement of fitness. The idea that sweat equals calorie loss is not true. You do expend some calories, but you can expend calories while not sweating just like you can when you're sweating. It's not a direct correlation to every time you're burning a lot of calories, you have to be sweating. That's not true. It's also not actual calories that the sweat is perspiring, is getting rid of in the body. That's not actual calories. There's a very popular phrase that sweat is fat crying. I love that, and I think I've used it myself. That's not actually true. That's not actually fat dissolving and leaking out your pores. I do want to talk about one athlete that does sweat a lot, but typically doesn't know it. And the reason we know they sweat a lot is because these athletes are some of the ones that have the highest rates of dehydration, and that's swimmers. Now, it seems kind of silly because they are floating in water, they're surrounded by water, they're immersed in water, they're under the water many times, but they are, I believe, the number one athlete for dehydration. And why? Because they're exerting themselves. They're exerting themselves like a track runner is or like a football player is, but they're not typically outside, or sometimes they are outside, but they're not immersed in that heat element because they're in the water. And typically, I don't know of any water that anybody swims in that's 98 degrees outside of a hot tub or what have you. But if you're swimming lap, you're not going to be in water that's 98.6 degrees. It may be 80 and you may find it to be way too warm, 80, 85, like a therapy pool at a hospital-based facility, but it's still not going to be 98 degrees and typically going to be somewhere in the 70s. So when they're exerting themselves, even if it's a grueling, 3,000, 3,500, 5,000 meter workout, they may or may not show any sweat or feel any sweat, obviously, because if their body is trying to produce that, but it's being washed away. Now, sweat is a trigger to remind you to drink water. And if you're not doing as you should, if you're not taking in 100 ounces on a regular basis, then you're not going to create that overreaching desire to drink water. Well past a craving. You have an overreaching desire. If you're taking in 100 ounces on a daily basis and you start falling behind, you're going to find your body is going to be craving water. So the swimmers don't crave the water. They're cooling their body off in the water. So therefore, they don't have that trigger, that natural trigger of, hey, I'm sweating. Wow, I probably should get something to drink. That doesn't occur. Therefore, they may drink water, but they're not drinking anywhere near to the amount that they need, Gatorade, water, or any kind of fluid to basically for hydration, not alcohol, not caffeine, anything that's diuretic. So they end up becoming dehydrated. So while a lot of them will come out of a hard workout and then go to sleep, the next morning they wake up with a serious headache. It's the same reason why you wake up with a headache after drinking a night of drinking alcohol, large amounts of alcohol. You're taking in a diuretic, you're getting rid of water, and one of the first things it's going to cause is going to cause a headache. So swimmers are one particular group that really need to pay attention to the amounts of water they're taking in. Now, when it comes to water and sweating, something you should know. If you are a distance runner or you're exercising quite a bit outside and you find yourself sweating a lot, you may be interested in knowing, okay, how much water do I need to replace? There's a few different ways of measuring this or eyeballing this, I guess you'd say. One thing is urine color. If urine color is dark, you're low in water, and you should increase your water intake. But another way to do that, especially if you're doing endurance sports, swimming is one of those, running or cycling. One thing to do is to weigh yourself prior to that exercise and then weigh yourself following. And you can get an idea of pounds lost, which is going to be, quote unquote, water weight. And that really is water weight. You expend a lot of, you perspire a lot, therefore you've lost a lot of water. It's the reason why a lot of endurance athletes don't really urinate after an event. It takes them a long time to, because their body is using up all that hydration. So if you weigh yourself before the exercise bout and then you weigh yourself afterwards, you'll get an idea of the difference of how much you're lost. If you've lost a pound of weight, well, then you've lost 16 ounces. So it's recommended that you drink at least 16 ounces of water, if not more. But usually if it's a long ride, like a century ride on the bike, and you're burning 3,000 plus calories, weigh yourself. You'll be quite shocked. You can lose 5 pounds or more even. And so whatever that number of pounds is, you multiply that by 16 ounces, and therefore you end up with how much weight and water you've lost. So whatever that number is that you come out in pounds, just multiply it by 16, like I say, and you'll find out how many ounces you need to take in. It's a good rule of thumb, a good way to measure whether or not you've become dehydrated during a workout. If you're interested in any more information on this subject or any other, you're welcome to contact me at my email address. That's Garrett, Garrett, at personaledgefitness.com. That's also our website, which is personaledgefitness.com, our Facebook page, Personal Edge Fitness, or call us at our Mobile or Eastern Shore location. We'd love to talk to you about sweat or anything else that we can do, any other questions we can answer to help you live your level of wellness. Please like and share to our podcast, and I'll speak to you next time. Have a good day.
Thanks for listening to the Personal Edge Fitness Podcast with Garrett Williamson. Subscribe now and be a part of the show by calling 888-278-EDGE or message us on Facebook and Instagram at Personal Edge Fitness or at Team PE on Twitter, and visit us at personaledgefitness.com.